want to take you on is kind of a little bit of a tour through the post-flood world. We're going to stop by first and kind of look at some varieties of apes that once lived in Africa and that evolutionists claim to be our ancestors. And we're going to see what they were like, what their lives were like, how they were different from humans. And then we're going to kind of move over to the human side, and we're going to look at some early humans that lived after the flood during the Ice Age. And so what I want to do in this talk is kind of trace for you the life stories, or kind of an idea of what the typical life of one of these creatures would have been like. So my talk is entitled Men and Apes After the Flood. And I want to begin by kind of setting up the time period for you, right? So we know, obviously, we're after the flood, but the rock layers that come from after the flood are divided into different groups. And the first time that we kind of see these animals that I call Australopithecines, that's a big word, but that name basically refers to this certain type of ape that lived in Africa. And they lived in this time period called the Pliocene. Now, really, this is probably just a small part of the entire post-flood era, which lasted just a few hundred years, of course. But during this time, the continents of the Earth were kind of approaching their modern placements, right? So during the flood, the original pre-flood continent broke up, came together back again, broke up again, and around this time after the flood, we're finally kind of approaching what looks like a modern distribution of the continents, right? North and South America are kind of basically where we'd expect them to be. They've separated from Africa and Europe. There's a few kind of weird things going on with shorelines, but in many ways, the Earth, at least kind of at a large scale geographically, is beginning to approach what it looks like in the modern world. And specifically, I want to focus in on a particular site in Ethiopia. This site is where many Australopithecine fossils have been found. And today, as you can see, it's a desert. This was a photograph that was taken back in the 1970s when scientists were doing field work uncovering bones from these animals. And you can see that this area today is an arid desert. But at this time, it wasn't like that at the time that these apes were living there. Instead, we can tell from plant fossils and from the teeth of these animals what they were eating. And they weren't eating rock and sand. This area was abundant. There were all sorts of plants growing here. In fact, this area was once a woodlands. There might have been a swamp nearby. There were rivers. So it was not an arid desert like this. There might have been grasslands, but not all this exposed rock. It was much more lush and green. And we can imagine that perhaps one kind of warm, humid afternoon, one female Australopithecine, one of these apes, went away from the rest of the group and began to climb up in a tree. And she reached a place where the tree branches divided and separated, and she took a branch and began to twist it back. She grabbed the end of the branch, began to twist it back towards the split in the trunk of the tree, and she wedged it there. Then she grabbed another branch and twisted it back again, and kept repeating this until she had a nice little platform. And then she took the little leaves and twigs that were sticking off of these branches and bent them upwards to create a kind of soft, leafy bed. Now, these Australopithecines probably spent most of their time living on the ground, but they were also adept at life in the trees. And perhaps, we don't know this for certain, perhaps like many living modern species of apes, such as gorillas, chimps, and orangutans, these Australopithecines went into the trees for safety at night. But as the night progressed, the humid night turned into a thunderstorm. And the lightning and the loud thunder scared the female, and she began to go into labor. Now, these apes were similar to chimpanzees in some ways, but they were also very similar to us in some ways. Now, this is a picture of the pelvis of chimpanzees on the left, Australopithecines, the column in the middle, and humans on the right. And what we're seeing here, that tan thing in the middle, is the head size of the infant, and the gray is the shape of the pelvis or the hips. And chimpanzees give birth very easily. Among chimpanzees, birth can take place in about an hour, I think even less. And it's very easy because they have a very large birth canal and a large pelvic inlet. And the head of the infant is small, right? Chimpanzees have very small brains. And as a result, they have a big space for the baby to come out of, and the baby is small, and therefore they can give birth very easily. On the far right, you see the problem with humans. We have a small birth canal and a big baby. The baby has a large head and it has wide shoulders that aren't flexible, as flexible as the shoulders of a chimpanzee infant. And as a result, human birth is a lot more painful and a lot more difficult because the baby has to basically turn. You can see there the head first starts out sideways, then it has to turn straight, and then it has to start turning again to get the shoulders through. So there's a lot of twisting and turning and pushing that's involved in human birth that we don't see in the birth of these apes because of this difference in pelvic anatomy. Now, the reason why humans, or part of the reason at least why humans have such difficulties with birth, is because we walk upright. And the way that our pelvis is structured that allows us to walk upright makes us have a smaller birth canal. And Australopithecines, those apes that we're discussing in that middle column, had a pelvis that was somewhat like ours. And they were walking upright like us. They weren't human ancestors. They weren't on the road to becoming human. They were apes. But these apes could stand upright on their hind legs and walk. And as a result, their pelvis looks like ours. And their muscle structure was more similar to ours than a chimpanzee's is. And as a result, they would have had more difficulty giving birth. So this female might have labored for hours trying to push this infant out. Here's a comparison of the pelvic bones. There on the left is a chimpanzee. In the middle, Lucy, an Australopithecus. And then on the right, a modern human. And you can see immediately that the chimpanzee pelvis is very tall. You can see right through the birth canal because of how tall the pelvis is. Whereas when you look at the Lucy, the Australopithecus, and the human from the front, you can't really see the birth canal because the pelvis is more squat and it's not so vertical. And this is part of what indicates to us that Lucy was walking upright. These Australopithecines, these apes, could stand on their hind legs. So this female finally, exhausted and sore, gave birth. And we know roughly what their infants would have looked like because we found fossils of young Australopithecine apes. And here you can see several different pictures of, I guess, what you would call toddlers, right? These all come from individuals that are between the ages of about 2 and 3. And we can tell this, 1, because they're very small, 2, because the bones of their head haven't grown into each other yet. So as you age, your bones fuse together, and we can tell that their bones aren't fused yet, telling us that they're young. We can also tell this because their baby teeth were still in. They were so young, they didn't have their adult teeth yet in. Their adult teeth were forming in their gums, but their adult teeth hadn't yet pushed through and erupted in their mouths yet. So we have multiple different examples of what these baby apes would have looked like. And they initially might have looked very similar to chimp and gorilla babies. They had very small brains. In that respect, they weren't really very more human-like than chimps and gorillas were. Their brains are very similar. They lack the distinctive parts that distinguish the human brain and allow us to have advanced cognition. And so these might have been very similar to chimp and gorilla babies. And there goes the skeleton of one of them. I do not know what happened there. But when we reconstruct them, gives you kind of an idea of what one of these individuals might have looked like. You can see there it standing upright on the ground, picking a piece of fruit out of the tree. So after these toddlers were weaned, they would have begun resuming kind of an adult diet. And for these Australopithecines, that would have meant eating things like fruit. So They would have been climbing in the trees to pick fruit. They would have eaten certain types of plants and roots, perhaps, that grew along the ground. They probably also might have eaten things like birds' eggs and little lizards. And so mainly herbivorous, but a few other kind of various sources of nutrition. But that might be roughly kind of what these apes would look like. Now, modern chimp mamas keep their babies very close to them for about the first year of their life. Here you can see a mother chimpanzee with her baby. Sometimes the baby holds onto her and hangs underneath her like it's hanging on a log. Sometimes it sits on top and rides on her mom's back. Australopithecines, though, since they were walking upright, probably their babies wouldn't have been able to hold on to them like this. So Australopithecine mothers probably held their babies, almost reminiscent of how human mothers do, but not because they were more intelligent or something like that, simply by necessity because they were walking on their hind legs. Now, we also have fossils. Once these babies would have grown up into adulthood, we understand what they would have looked like because we have fossils of middle-aged Australopithecine individuals. And what we see is that although they walked upright, they were very clearly still participating in arboreal activity. That means they were climbing in the trees. Their forearms were quite long in relation to their legs. And that meant that they were probably doing a significant amount of climbing. Their shoulders were able to move in ways that our shoulders can't really. That would allow them to kind of have their arms up above their head and be hanging from their hands a little bit. So they were very active in the trees, unlike humans, but they could walk on the ground as well. So the skeleton that you see there in the middle of the screen there, that's Lucy. That's one of the most famous kind of ape-man skeletons. So Lucy was an Australopithecus. And on the right there, you can see kind of a reconstruction of what Lucy might have looked like. And you notice that she looks very hairy, very ape-like, except that she's standing on her hind legs. Now, on the left there is another Australopithecus skeleton, we think. It's kind of fragmentary, but it appears to come from the same species as Lucy, but it's a lot larger. And we think that it came from a male. So if you think men and women today, men tend to be physically larger and taller than women. If we go to something like a gorilla or chimpanzee, that difference between the sexes is really exaggerated, right? For example, we have silverback gorillas. Gorilla males, their back will turn kind of a silvery gray color, unlike the typical black that you see in females and young males. And they get very, very large, significantly larger than the females. So here we think what we're seeing is actually some difference in terms of size between males and females. Like modern apes, Australopithecines might have been we call it sexually dimorphic, meaning that the males and females would have been different sizes. So that skeleton on the left comes from a guy possibly called Katanumu, the one in the middle from Lucy. So the one on the left seems to be a male and the one in the middle a female. And you can kind of see in this reconstruction on the right, the male looks very large and the female looks kind of small. So kind of an interesting example there. And what we see in these Australopithecines when we look at their teeth is kind of an interesting pattern. So chimps and gorillas tend to have very long canine teeth, those kind of sharp, pokey teeth in the front of your mouth. And part of the reason why is because there's a lot of interspecies aggression. So males are fighting with each other to get mates. Here in Australopithecines, that lessens quite a bit. So maybe they were living in kind of broader groups where there wasn't as much competition for females. Maybe they were monogamous compared to the polygamous lifestyle of gorillas and chimpanzees. We don't really know. We can only speculate about that. But there appears to be decreased interspecific aggression. Now, the Australopithecines eventually met their demise. And some Australopithecines went in a not very pleasant way. Here is a skull that comes from southern Africa. And you can see there are two big puncture marks in the back of the skull, those kind of round holes there. And those, it turns out, basically perfectly match the distance between the canine teeth of leopards. So these apes were prey for animals like leopards. You can see there on the right a reconstruction of what it might have looked like when the leopard bit into this individual's skull. Right. A little gory here. But this sort of predation may have actually formed some of the fossil sites that we see today. So where this fossil is from in southern Africa, this was found in the cave system. And in South Africa, trees tend to grow around cave systems because there's the depression in the ground, more water available, therefore plants can grow better. So trees tend to grow around cave systems. And leopards store their prey in trees. So perhaps what happened here is that a leopard went and hunted an Australopithecine, took its prey up into a tree, and then the bones of this individual dropped down into the cave beneath and were preserved. So life as an Australopithecine would have been dangerous. They didn't have complex tools with which to ward off predators. There are some very simple tools that some people think might have belonged to them, but that is very much a matter of debate. So there's no real good evidence that Australopithecines were making complex tools. They don't appear to have had fire either to scare off predators. So life was dangerous. Predators like this could climb trees and snatch you away while you were sleeping. For Lucy, death might have come in a different way. Some scientists think that Lucy might have died by falling out of a tree. And here you can see kind of a reconstruction of that. They did a forensic analysis of her body and they noted all these different breaks in her bones. And I think that she fell, her legs kind of hit the ground and crumpled first. And then she tried to catch herself with her hand and it broke basically all of her arm bones all the way up to her shoulder, just shattering her shoulder bone. So eventually, in some way, the Australopithecines went extinct. This particular kind of ape did not make it to the present. This was just one of many different ape kinds that got originally made. The Australopithecines were originally aboard the Ark, but they didn't survive, for example, to the time of Abraham. They eventually ended up going extinct. They didn't give rise to chimps and gorillas. They weren't related to humans. They were unintelligent apes, but they could walk upright. So interesting. Very similar to humans in that respect, but very different in terms of the shape of their skull and their brain, and very different certainly in terms of their cultural abilities as well. Now, here I want to kind of transition from the story of these apes that lived after the flood to the story of humans. Now, humans, of course, landed on the ark and they began to settle. We hear that Noah built a vineyard near, presumably perhaps near the mountains of Ararat. We're not really sure exactly where he built that vineyard. And a time later, they began to go to the plain of Shinar and to build the Tower of Babel. But from there, God dispersed them over the earth. And early people show up across the old world, down in Africa, way out in Asia, up in Europe. But all these different types of people that very quickly after Babel dispersed over the world were very short-lived. By about the time of Abraham, many of these people groups were dying out. We don't know why. It's possible that this is the result of aggression, of wars that are going on, of people fighting each other, or conquering a local tribe, taking their females. So these other groups are kind of getting integrated into other populations. So we don't really know exactly why, but many of these different types of humans that had diversified, that were from Noah's line and gone into these various parts of the earth, began to go extinct. And I want to focus specifically on the story of the Neanderthals, some of the last Neanderthals. Some of the very last Neanderthal fossils come from a site in Europe, right at the base of the rock of Gibraltar. So here we're seeing the rock of Gibraltar from the sea, and you can notice there that there are kind of all those kind of dark cave-like entrances into the rock here, and those are all caves. Now, by the time of the Neanderthals, the Ice Age had begun. And as a result, because all the water from the oceans was being dumped on the continents, sea level began to go down. So at the time Neanderthals lived here, they didn't have beachfront property. That would only come later. When the Neanderthals lived at this site, the water was way far off, perhaps miles away from this actual rock here. but perhaps close enough for them to visit and utilize for food. And we see that, well, this isn't actually a Neanderthal fossil from that site, but we have fossils of Neanderthal children. This is a particular fossil from France. Once again, we can tell this because of how the skull is fused and the development of the teeth, that this is a baby Neanderthal. And we have evidence that Neanderthal mothers cared and loved their children. This, for example, is from a cave in Syria. This is the Didaria site. And scientists there found this Neanderthal child, and it appears to have been buried in this cave. And you can see there in the reconstruction of the burial on the right, how a rock was placed above the head of the child, perhaps as a symbolic marker for this individual's grave. Very interesting. Recently, if you followed the channel, you're probably aware that there was a discovery of a Neanderthal infant who had Down syndrome. Actually, it wasn't an infant. It was 6 years old, which is quite remarkable how late that individual survived, even with the challenges that it faced. So Neanderthals cared for, and probably, it appears, ritually buried their young. Here's a reconstruction of what a young Neanderthal might have looked like. And you can see, fundamentally, he looks very human. This is clearly a descendant of Noah. This is very human. This isn't some sort of ape or a brutish caveman. This is a human. And we have various places, for example, where we have traces of young Neanderthals. This is from a site in France where they were able to find all of these different footprints, and you can see there a handprint from Neanderthals. And interestingly, the researchers who worked at this site noticed that the child's footprints were much more scattered across the beach, indicating that the children were kind of running around away from the rest of the group, looking in all these different directions, and kind of the adults were there keeping everybody in check, kind of giving us a very early insight into kind of the curiosity and playfulness of Neanderthal children. So Neanderthals lived inside of these caves. Neanderthals, we have no evidence that they were building houses. Instead, they were resting in these caves, and they would make fires that they would put at the entrances of these caves. And those fires would scare off predators which might come into the caves. And we'll get to that in a minute, but there were predators like cave lions and cave bears that are larger than modern species of lions and bears that would have been very dangerous. And so Neanderthals would build these fires at the mouths of these caves to scare away predators, and they would sleep and work within. Now, perhaps as a young Neanderthal, what you might have done with the elders was learn how to make stone tools. Neanderthals had a certain type of technology called the Mousterian culture. And basically, in this form of stone tool making, you start with a larger block and you roughly shape it. And then you kind of go along and make a bunch of smaller breaks along the edge to come up with a very thin, nice, smooth edge. So these weren't quite as advanced as those that you would show up in later cultures that would end up being really, really tiny masterpieces. But already this was an advanced kind of form of stone tool making that certainly required, intuition and cognition and planning. And this appears to be the result of kind of this loss of technology after Babel. When God spread people out after Babel, people lost the ability to do things like metallurgy. And as a result, many groups had to turn towards the other most obvious source to make tools from, wood and stone. And we find that Neanderthals used both of these materials and probably bone as well. We have spears, for example, that Neanderthals used. We also have evidence that Neanderthals had the capability to create symbolism. This is from that same site of Gorham's Cave in the Rock of Gibraltar. And there you can see kind of ancient tic-tac-toe game that they were playing on the walls of the cave. No, we don't really know exactly what this was, but they took some rock and they were scratching it on the wall. Here's another site. I believe this is from Spain, a cave in Spain, where based on dating, we think Neanderthals were drawing with a red iron mineral on the walls of the cave. And there you can see we have a more kind of complex shape. We don't really know what it means or symbolizes, but clearly very complex and more sophisticated than we would see in animals, certainly. Now, Neanderthals, we found many different Neanderthal fossils. Right on the left there is a very beautifully preserved Neanderthal specimen from a site in Israel, preserving much of the upper limbs and the torso. But we also have this bone here on the right. Does anybody know what this bone is? It's not one of the bones that gets talked about very frequently. This is the hyoid bone. And it's the only bone in your body that is free floating, meaning that it doesn't line up with any of your other bones. All your other bones connect to each other. But this bone sits right up here underneath your kind of by your Adam's apple, above your Adam's apple a little bit. And this is where the muscles of your tongue are anchored. So your tongue muscles go back down your throat and then connect there to the hyoid bone. So by looking at the hyoid, we can distinguish between apes and humans. Australopithecines, those apes that lived in Africa that we were talking about earlier, had a hyoid bone that was very similar to chimps and gorillas because they weren't using their hyoid bone to talk. They instead had air sacs that we see in chimps connected to their hyoid bone, giving it a bit of a different shape. But here we see that Neanderthals had a very human-like hyoid, basically indistinguishable from that of modern people. And this is part of the evidence that suggests that Neanderthals were capable of speech. So what we're all seeing here is that these Australopithecines and these Neanderthals are radically different. And in the fossil record, we don't really see anything that is bridging the gap. We can clearly distinguish between humans and non-humans, generally based on the cultural evidence that we see. And Neanderthals were certainly human, and Australopithecines were certainly not human. Here's another reconstruction of a Neanderthal, giving you an idea of what they might have looked like. And once again, you can see that this isn't really a primitive, brutish person. It's someone who would have been at home in modern society if they could time travel. Now, Neanderthals were also big hunters. This is the skeleton of a lion, a cave lion. And you can see there in the upper right, that is a big dent in a rib bone of this lion that was made by a Neanderthal spear point. So Neanderthals were aggressive hunters. And what you have to remember here is that Neanderthals were physically different from us. Their bones were much more robust. They had stronger muscle markings. A Neanderthal is going to beat you when bench pressing any day. I went the other year, to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History and saw one of the original Neanderthal specimens, like the real fossils from Israel. And it's amazing how much larger their individual bones are than ours. Amazing. So these were strong people, and they needed to be because of the difficulties of living in a post-flood world with these large predators around, with all these catastrophic geological events occurring. They were very tough. They were up to the challenge. And this evidence, the way that they butchered this lion, appears to indicate that they were cutting off its fur. So they were living in Europe during the Ice Age, of course, and so they would have needed clothing. So Neanderthals appear to have been harvested furs, I think, from lions, but we also have some other evidence, I believe, from seals. It is that they were harvesting seal skins as well. Now, for food, Neanderthals were hunting all sorts of different animals, from ibex to mammoths. They were also exploiting different types of grains, and we can tell this by doing little studies of their teeth, basically scraping off some little residue clinging to the teeth and looking at the different types of plant material that is still preserved there. And they were using and probably like processing different types of plants to eat. When they got old, Neanderthals were probably cared for by the rest of the group. This is a Neanderthal fossil called the Old Man of La Chapelle. It comes from a site in France. And this guy had basically lost all of his teeth. I think he had 2 teeth left in his mouth. And he was old. He couldn't go out and hunt. But Neanderthals lived in little groups. And so it seems likely that the other group members cared for this individual long after he would have been able to go out and hunt, and long after he would have been able to, chomp and chew on regular food. So they probably softened food for him. Another instance of this interpersonal care in these small, close-knit communities after the flood. And when he died, this man appears to have been buried. He was placed in a cave in France, and a little trench was dug in the ground where his bones were placed and where scientists eventually found him. So, giving kind of some concluding thoughts, we've looked at Neanderthals and at Australopithecines, men and apes after the flood. And what we've seen is that although these Australopithecines, these apes, were human-like in that they could walk upright, they were generally very ape-like. They didn't have advanced cognition, they couldn't make complex tools, and they eventually went extinct, and they didn't give rise to chimps, gorillas, or to humans. On the other hand, many of these descendants of Noah, such as Neanderthals, were smart. They buried their dead. They made more complex tools. They used fire. And in fact, many of you who are watching probably have Neanderthal ancestry, because when our own species, Homo sapiens, moved into Europe, our ancestors interbred with the Neanderthals. And so we are today still part Neanderthal. And so I hope that this talk, kind of a little laid back, a little storytelling here, gave you some insight into what life was like after the flood for both apes and men. So thank you all for listening.